Hello and welcome to an introduction tutorial to using the CryPixels procedural game art generator. So when you open the software, you'll be presented with a new grid screen. You can either fill in your grid dimensions and whether you want the grid mirrored here, or you could just go ahead and exit out of this and you'll be presented with a default 8x8 grid, and you could then go into your grid setup and resize the grid from here. Also, I'm just going to reset the software to bring that screen back up. You can also open a file from this new grid screen, and again you also have that option from within the grid tools to load a grid. So I'm going to go ahead and start with a blank grid, and I'm going to resize this grid to 12 by 15 pixels, and I'll come back to this resize pivot point area later on in the tutorial. So I'm happy with the size of my grid, and I'm also going to mirror it on the x-axis. So anything I create in here will be mirrored over here. You can also mirror on the y-axis, and you can also mirror on both axes. So just the x-axis is what I want. I can then close this down, so the grid tools and the generate settings are both collapsible. So I'm going to close that down for now. I'm then going to focus on my brushes for the generation grid. So we have body empty, which is saying it could have pixels in it, it might not have pixels in it. Body border is saying it will have pixels in it, but there's a 50% chance it'll be a body pixel, which means just a normal shaded pixel, and there's a 50% chance it'll be a border pixel, which is a darker pixel. Always border means it'll always be a border pixel. That's for defining darker areas in your sprite, and always body is where you want an area in your sprite to be pixels, but you don't want it to have the possibility to be a darker pixel. You then have the eraser, which is self-explanatory, and pan to pan the grid. So I'm going to go ahead and populate this grid. I'm going to use the keyboard shortcuts. So Q, W, E, R is your brushes, D for delete is your eraser, and spacebar is pan. And there's also shortcuts for all the other things you see in the software, which you can check by opening up the shortcuts button. So first of all, I'm going to design the shape, and I'm going to create a spaceship. So I'm defining the general spaceship shape. I'm going to have it come down a bit. I actually want this grid to be one larger, so I'm going to go in, resize grid, and make it one taller. There we go, I'm happy with that. I'm going to flick to a 2-pix brush. There's also a shortcut for that, which is it's S for size. And I'm just going to quickly fill in this, go back to my 1-pix brush. Okay, so if I close that down, so if I go ahead and hit regenerate now, or Control R, you'll see I have some basic ships, and they're looking pretty good. But it's a bit of a mess on where the dark pixels are. It really could be anywhere, and we're also getting these gaps in the middle of the ship that I don't want. So I'm going to go ahead and tweak this generation grid. So I'm going to use the body border brush. I'm going to say this section here, I really want to always be pixels. So I don't want it to be empty, but I'm still giving the software a chance to decide whether that's a body pixel or a darker border pixel. Then I'm going to use my always border brush and say, you know what, I want this area of the ship to be defined as sort of the cockpit area. So I want that always to be the border. And let's generate that. And I think it's starting to get there. It's starting to look quite a lot better. I'm going to put one more border pixel up there. Okay, so that's looking pretty good. There's one final thing you can do. On smaller grids, you wouldn't want to use the always body pixel. On larger grids, it can come in handy when you just want to create a little more sort of high definition in areas where you don't want those dark pixels creeping in. So I'm going to say this area here, know what, I want that to always be the body. I don't want any dark pixels or empty pixels creeping in that area. And you can see there it's just added a bit of sort of definition to the sprite. So we also have the eraser, which, like I said, is self-explanatory for deleting sprites. We can pan it, we can zoom it, zoom in, zoom out. You can undo and redo up to 10. Clear grid will come up with a warning. I don't want to do that, but that's essentially going to clear the whole grid. Our output views, at the moment we're in split view, which means we can regenerate while viewing the grid. In grid view, we just have the grid, and in output view, we just have our outputted sprites. In output view, both the grid tools and also all the brush tools are grayed out, just so you can't accidentally make any destructive changes to your grid when you're not viewing it. If you're in grid mode and you hit regenerate, it'll automatically put you into split mode so that you can see what you've generated. So I'm happy with the generation grid. I'm now going to go to my output view so that I've got a bit more room, and I'm going to go into my generate settings. So the first setting is the output number. So at the moment we're generating, sorry about that. So at the moment we're generating 100, and you can generate up to 500 at a time. So you can see now we've generated 500. The output scale is the scale of the pixels. So at the moment it's scaling the original pixel size by 4. If I made that 1, sorry, let me just click off that. You can see they're now an original size. 2 is probably something you'd use for a slightly sort of high resolution pixel game, and I think 4 is sort of a nice default. And you can bump that all the way up to 8. Background color is just for preview purposes, so when you output the sprite, it'll have transparent pixels around the sprite and in the empty areas in the sprite, but you might want to preview it. So let's say for this game it's going to be a space game, it's going to be on a blue background. You can set that for preview purposes. We also have a 1-bit mode that I'm going to come back to in a minute. So options on outputting the sprites. We have a border darkness. If I set that down and regenerate, you see the border's gone. If I set it all the way up, you'll see the border pixels are black. You can double click to reset to default, and I think 70 is a nice default. Color variations, at the moment there's the odd sprite with a mix of colors. If I took that all the way down, all sprites are going to be one color. If I took that all the way up, you're going to get loads of colors in there. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to jump down to saturation, which is the color saturation, and I bump that all the way up to 100 just to show you these color variations at 100. You wouldn't ever have it at 100, I wouldn't say, but if we put that up to something like 70, you can see how much more variation there is in each sprite. So let's set that back down to its default, and we'll take the saturation down a bit as well. Okay, body noise is, so in the body pixels, it's how much noise is actually in there to sort of darken the body pixels and create a sort of pixelated effect. So if I took that all the way down, you see that inside the sprites, they're pretty much just a solid color. I've got auto lighting on, so they do darken near the edges, but it's just pretty much a solid color. If I bring the body noise up, you can see that inside the sprites is now a lot more pixelated. You can see that for this size sprite, that is way too much body noise. But if I put it at, say, 30, you can see that's creating a nice sprite. We've already gone through saturation. If you took that all the way down, it would essentially create grayscale sprites. Let's bring that back up to 70. Now what is useful is the gradient direction. So at the moment, any color variations, let's just bring that up a bit so we can see them. So at the moment, any color variations could be going left to right, or they could be going top to bottom. If we force it in one direction, so let's force it vertical, now the color variations are always coming top to bottom. So on something like a ship, I'd say you always want them top to bottom. On a sprite that you're maybe mirroring on the y-axis instead of the x-axis, you might want them coming left to right. It's just a case of what you're designing. I think for a ship, if I had them left to right, it would look odd, one wing being a different colour than the other wing. So I think for a ship, having them always vertical looks better. And you can also have them random. The final setting is disable auto lighting. So at the moment, when you select a gradient, it does two things. It decides the direction of any color variation. So if you have a variation, let's pick an obvious one. So this one, green and blue, it's top to bottom because we've selected vertical gradient. But it also decides the auto lighting pixels. So also on all these sprites, the body pixels are darker at the top and bottom and lighter in the middle. And if I take the color variations down, you can see this here. So these top pixels and bottom pixels are darker, and that's because it's on vertical. Horizontal, you can see the left and right pixels are darker, and the middle's lighter. So if we disable auto lighting, we now just have them one solid color going across. This doesn't mean that this setting doesn't do anything. This setting is still responsible for color variations. So if you have auto lighting disabled, this as vertical gradient is still deciding what way those color variations are going to happen. So it decides both the color variations and the auto lighting direction. If we disable auto lighting, we have a second option for the base brightness. So this is the base body brightness that then the body noise is applied on top of. So if we set this all the way up, we've got bright sprites. If we set it down, we've got dark sprites. And obviously you could have bright sprites and then add quite a bit more body noise onto it. So what we're going to do is just reset these to their defaults, and I'm actually going to put auto lighting back on. So they're the basic output settings. Another mode we have is 1-bit mode. If we tick 1-bit mode, all of these settings are disabled, and we have an extra color option. This is the option of the sprite. So if I change that to green and then change my background color to black, so I'm creating a sort of DOS style artwork here, and hit regenerate, you see now they're just generating in 1-bit mode. This is really handy for sort of old school retro art games. We could also do blue, a white on blue, which is another sort of retro look. And also you can use this if you want black and white sprites but without the gradient. So where we took saturation down, they were grayscale sprites. If we want pure black and white sprites, you can do that as well. And we just disable that. So we'll now go back to the split view, and I'll just quickly run over a few extra settings. So under grid tools and setup, we can also flip the grid on the x-axis and flip it on the y-axis. We can resize the grid. Now this pivot point is important. So at the moment it's from the top left. So if I make this grid taller, it'll add the pixels to the bottom. But you can select where to resize it from. So if I select the middle and make it 14 by 18, so I'm adding on pixels here, you can see that it's added them on all around it. And then let's say I decide I don't need that strip. If I resize it from the left, so all of these is where the resize is happening, and take off the width, take one off the width, it takes it off from there. So it's handy if you build a grid and decide it's too big or too small, you can choose where to resize it from. Now we're going to quickly demonstrate another purpose. So at the moment we've built this grid, and one thing to note is, let me resize it to the size it was. What have I done here? So 15 and then one extra at the bottom. So this is how the grid was. I've left a space on all edges bar the right hand edge because it's being mirrored. So where it's being mirrored you don't need a space. where it's not being mirrored, it's always advised to leave 1 pixel space so that the software can decide whether to put a pixel in or not. So you can see this space here. On some sprites it's blank, on some sprites pixels pushed into it. So you always want to leave 1 pixel around the body empty areas just to give the software a chance to decide the shape of the object. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to clear this grid. I'm going to resize it to 4x4, and I'm going to mirror this on both axes. And I'm going to now demonstrate creating a sort of a seed object. So when I say a seed, just letting the software just generate random pixel objects. So this can be handy for games where you want to create sort of jewels or crates or just random shape objects, and you can just go ahead and generate 500 or so and just pick the ones you like. So I'm just going to create this shape, which is going to obviously mirror, and I'm just going to hit generate on the default settings, and you can see that it's just created a load of just sort of random objects. And obviously you could you could tweak this. So you know what, I'm going to make it 1 bigger, and then I'm going to round off the edge a little bit to make it a bit more circular. And you see what I've done there. You could say I don't want the software to be able to make the center non-solid, so you know what, I'm going to put body border in here so that there's always something in the middle. And you can just go ahead and create a load of sort of random seeds if you like. That's another thing you can do. The software comes with a load of example grids. I'm going to go ahead and quickly load one now. So the rounded 1, 2, 3 and square 1, 2, 3 are similar to what we've just done. We have some swords, some spaceships, and a monster and a robot. I'm just going to load one of the swords to just show you how you can also use this software for much more defined artwork. So here we've defined pretty much the shape of the sword and the handle, and all we're letting the software do is basically sort of do this area here and also the colouring. So you can use it to generate a lot of variations of something more defined in shape. And if I go ahead and generate these, you can see here the swords. And you can see for something like this, we're going to want to take body noise down. Colour variations, you're going to want always, to be honest, you're not going to want any colour variations, but you're going to want the shading going from left to right to create the sword blade. Body noise right down, bring saturation up a bit. And just by doing those settings, that's probably a little bit too light, but just by doing those settings, you can see we got some pretty good swords. I'd still say that's a bit too light. A bit more body noise. Yeah, so we've generated some swords, and you can also use it for something completely defined in shape. So let's go back to our grid and load. Actually, I haven't got one here. You know, we'll leave it there for the first tutorial. So that's the basics of how to use the software. The only other thing I've got to mention is to export these sprites, click on them, right click, and you can save it as either 1x, which is the original pixel size, so it's, if you save it as 1x, it's ignoring what you've got in here, or you can save it as scaled, which is going to save it as the output scale, so as you see it on the screen. And that pretty much wraps it up. So hope you enjoyed a quick tour of the software. There's lots of updates to come. We're going to constantly improve it. Feel free to follow us on Twitter and comment below, and we'll do our best to get back to you.